us.
Okay.
Yeah, just the three of us get down there. What we'll probably do is leave here about like 7 a.m. Walk on the boardwalk for a little bit, like get a cup of coffee on the boardwalk, um, and then hit a place for lunch, and then go spend the rest of the day at the beach, and then just come home and put him in pajamas before we leave, and he'll fall asleep on the way home.
That sounds nice. What's the beach weather this time of year?
Right now it is hot and humid,
Yeah.
so it is going to be a hot one on Friday.
Okay. Well, I guess you have to get in the water then, right?
Yeah, we'll be
Yeah.
playing in the water.
That sounds fun. That sounds fun. Unfortunately, I don't have a beach near me.
Yeah, that's the one thing living here. There's things we talk about. Oh, let's move here, let's go there, but we like the idea of the beach being an hour and a half away.
Yeah, I mean, it's so accessible.
And
Not
simple day
not
trips are
too.
possible.
Yeah. Well, if you have it, you should take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think. Well, cool. I'd like a beach trip. It's wicked hot here.
Yeah,
So,
right now it's sunny, hot, humid. It's like people have asked, like, well, what do you do when it's weather's like this? I'm like, you're either inside the air conditioning or you're neck deep in water.
yeah. It's the only way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, glad you're going to be able to do that. That should be fun.
Yeah, and it goes along with the episode we recorded last week around time off, and we obviously entitled unlimited time off, but just the
Yeah.
flexible time off.
Flexible. Yeah. Autonomy. Ability
Yeah.
to define your schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Yeah, and it's that was a good conversation last week, and yeah, kind of continued the conversation on social media. I like we've tried to do some of these episodes where I've got reached out for real-time interaction, and it never seems to work. But when
Mm-hmm.
I've done it asynchronously from our episodes, like all this like comments and feedback comes piling in. So
Yep.
yeah, it's good to hear what from others. It's good to hear that. I guess I tend to take a very jaded approach that every employer is out there trying to screw over their employees, but it's good to hear from a lot of people that they're trying, and none of us have it figured out. And especially as the work landscape is so fluid right now and evolving, we're testing, and I think it's important to always be in a mode of learning, that constantly checking what works, what doesn't. But it's good to see that employers are taking it seriously, and um, helping create some autonomy to allow their employees to enjoy the flexibility. At least from our experience, the return on that investment is almost beyond. Well, it is beyond measure. I mean, it's incredible.
So, what are some of the things you're hearing?
So, hearing a lot more about um, how much time we're quote working. So a lot more discussion around, do we go to a 4-day work week, especially during the summers. It sounds like optional or less structured Fridays. Maybe use it more of a time to hang out and have fun with teammates, or not do anything at all. It's this morning I started a discussion around just home office setup and compensation, or coverage of things like cell phone bills or internet bills. And um, it's been great to hear people say, oh yeah, not only that, but like we have like a monthly stipend where it's like we can get like a gym membership or streaming service or do other fun things. And so it's good to see employers realize, I guess, one, it's not a lot of cost up front to be able to provide some of those niceties to the team. And we've talked about it, like you give them that sense that they can control things that make them feel good. I can have a keyboard that I really like, I can subscribe to a music streaming service that makes my office environment a little nicer. I mean, it's pennies, but having a happy employee is again priceless. And so it's good to see It's good to see some of those things happening. And obviously, a different scenario for us where we started the company as a fully distributed company day one. But a lot of these companies, there's a lot of cost involved with having someone in office. You have to supply the desks and the hardware and all of this stuff and just the facilities to have them in the building. I don't necessarily expect that all to go back to the employees, but for companies to simply pocket that because now, oh, well, Jim works at home and Jim already has internet and a phone and a desk and a computer. We'll just let him use that and not either support that or reinvest those funds in some other way back in employees. It's really concerning to me that companies are going to do that, and some will for sure. But it's good to hear that there are lots that aren't, that are using those savings and reinvesting them back in employees. Is good to see.
Yeah, and that tweet, I saw it about an hour ago, and it plays great into today's topic. Um, so as I mentioned when we started last week's episode, I wanted to do a couple episodes around job hunting or recruiting, looking at it from both perspectives, both the prospective employee and the employer.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about benefits today,
Okay.
because you and I have talked many times on the podcast, off the podcast. Like, you and I got similar advice from both our parents and our grandparents. The benefits that come with a job, and I know, like, from my grandparents' generation, that was pension, which then turned into 401k,
Yeah.
health coverage for yourself, for your family, those kind of
Yep.
things. Like, those were critical for any kind of employment package that you were negotiating. Um, but obviously, and you've really kind of set it up great about, like, the changing landscape of employment, because a lot of people, like, especially if you're going into an office, you're expecting that office space is going to be provided to you.
Yeah.
um a computer, or the tools of the trade are going to be provided to you. Like, I mean, computer, okay, that's office staff, but maybe other lines of work, the tools necessary to complete your job are going to be provided to you, whether it's a phone, or whether it's a company phone, or whatnot. Um, and yeah, as people are going remote, like, I know a lot of people, when COVID kicked off in March of 2020 and everyone was just abruptly told to go home, they had to figure it out. Where am I working from? I know people that were working from the kitchen table until they got it
Yeah.
figured out, because they were going into the office all the time. And so they didn't have any need for necessarily a home office.
Yeah.
Maybe they had a study, but it wasn't set up to be or a study or a den or whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't meant to be like a permanent work location. So a lot of people were
Excuse me.
were scrambling, and then students were being sent home. And I don't know about you, but, like, desks, getting anywhere in this area, whether it be in store, online, whatever, finding a desk
Mm,
was not easy to come by. And I'm starting to ramble, but I want to kind of make it a bit more concise to really dig into the topic. So where I'm going with all of this is these days, whether the job's remote, hybrid, in office, what are benefits that matter? What are the key things that go beyond salary? We get blinded by the salary. A lot of people do. Like, everyone was talking about at the beginning of this year, the great resignation. People were getting money thrown at them. And you started to see that there was a bit of a backlash from that, where all of a sudden people were like, well, maybe this job wasn't all it was cracked up to be.
yeah.
We see it all the time in digital analytics. People get money thrown at them after a couple of years of experience, and people get blinded by the salary.
Yeah.
What other things that come along with a job are important? And I mean, there's so many different
Oh my
directions we can take
gosh.
it.
I
So let's
mean,
just jump in and go.
we probably need 10 hours to record this episode. So I'm going to start with the non-tangible things first because I think those things are highest up on the list. Um, and really that comes down to a sense of freedom and autonomy. I think after a certain level of compensation, your wages, your salary, um, nothing else moves the needle more than having a sense of control over your day. And you and I have talked about this both on the podcast and privately around um, just how stressful and energy zapping it is not to feel like you have any control over what you're doing as an employee. And so, if employers are offering competitive wages, and that obviously differs by industry and by role, but if it's competitive, the most important thing to be thinking about is what things can I do to give a sense of trust to my employees, that we trust them. We're going to give them some autonomy, and we're going to allow them within some guardrails of how we operate as a company and our culture, design how they work best. And a lot of the, I think a lot of the arguments for and against remote work are misguided and have been for a long time, where we get so incredibly passionate talking about where work happens. It's better in office because you can collaborate and you're more creative, or it's better at home because you can go have lunch with your kids or just step out and go for a walk. And yeah, I mean, there's merit to having those conversations, but to me, that is third on the list of things that we should be talking about. And the two things that are much more valuable than that are the how and the when. Meaning, when do I work? Do I have still this rigid expectation of 8 to 5, or have we blown that concept out of the water and say, no, especially for employees that do work that can be done asynchronously, let's allow them to work when they're best. Some people are morning people, some people are night people, some people are morning and then a little bit in the afternoon and then a lot at night. Allow them that freedom and autonomy to define when they work. And then secondarily, how they work. Meaning, again, give them a sense of autonomy and control to design how they work best, especially if you're hiring incredibly smart, experienced people. You don't want to hire really smart people and then say, okay, and not to demean the role of working on the line at McDonald's, but if you work for like a fast food restaurant, everything is prescribed. You take this patty out of this location, you put it here for 30 seconds. After 30, it's very operationalized. And so giving employees a sense that, yeah, ultimately we want to take these raw ingredients and create this amazing output from it, but how we get there, we're going to allow you some freedom and control over how that is done. Those things are so much more important than the where that we are working. And so as we think about compensation and things that are important to evaluate as we're looking to figure out where the best place it is for us to work, it's always going to be salary number one. Am I meeting my needs? Is it helping me unlock the things that I want to unlock? But very quickly after that, it's a sense of freedom, a sense of autonomy in the job.
Yeah. So, funny story. Over the last 3 years, a lot of well, 3.5 years, some of my behaviors have changed, my routines have changed. I've talked many times about my morning routine, and having a little one, and then my wife teaching from home when COVID kicked off, and now her deciding to take a couple of years off to be at home. My morning routine used to be I'd go to the gym, I'd come home, house be quiet, get my shower, do this, do a couple things, and then be at the computer all dressed and ready to go by 8:45.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward to today, and like literally today, I've got a 3.5-year-old who is struggling right now sleeping. He's always been
Mm,
a great sleeper, but this week it's just like he's just fighting it, waking up in the middle of the night and everything. When you talk about where and when to get work done, there have been a couple mornings this week where I've gotten a late workout in. I get in, I take a couple morning phone calls, right in my sweaty gym clothes. Nobody knows or is none the wiser.
yeah.
And then I go get showered, cleaned up, or whatever. But that flexibility of not having to be dressed and showered and out the door by 8:15 to be in the office or whatever, I'm able to kind of just adjust as life happens.
Yeah. It's such an incredible feeling to be able to again have that sense of control that it's not so rigid, and not even so rigid in how you define it, right? Because this week it can look one way, the next week it can look a completely different way, and you don't have to go to bed at night with that stress of like, I have all these things I kind of want to do. It would make life so much easier, but I can't because I have this rigid schedule that I have to adhere to.
Hmm.
So I do. I think that freedom and autonomy is so close after compensation. And I think the third component, we're still not getting to the tangible things yet. I think that that third component really is around having a sense of purpose. Again, especially if you're hiring super experienced people. I've heard it time and time again. Yeah, my employer pays really well. Yeah, I've got some autonomy. Yeah, I've got some great perks, but like I'm literally doing nothing that matters. Whether that's true or not, that's how they feel. And at a certain point in your career, all those other things start to hold less value if you're spending huge chunks of your time that you feel is just doing work to do work and you're not actually creating any value out of that output. Um,
How many people do we know that we've worked with over the years that in recent years have moved into some kind of hobby that has physical, tangible output?
oh man, more people than I can count off the top of my head.
And it's exactly that reason, I think. That's one of the
Yeah.
things. I think it's twofold. One, in our particular space, nothing we produce is tangible. Everything is out there in the ether, to use a cliche.
Hmm.
It's and a lot of times, how many times have we built something and then client moves on to a different vendor and rips everything right down?
Yeah.
Like, I immediately think of Randy and his guitars.
Hmm.
Moving into a hobby like that, using your hands, there's some kind of physical output, and I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah. I'll challenge you in one way, in that I don't disagree with you, but I also think it's a matter of perspective. And what I mean by that is when I worked client side for 4 years, I took literally nothing existed, not even a vanilla Google Analytics implementation when I took the job at Spark Networks to build out an analytics program. So literally nothing there, and over a 4 year period built, obviously I'm biased, but what I felt was a world class example of how to build a highly functioning, high value program that not only had incredibly rich analysis and insight capabilities, but was also a fully functional optimization and personalization program as well across 10 plus brands. I was incredibly proud of that, and I put a lot of my self-worth in that product. It's like that was my tangible output, right? I
Mhm.
spent 4 years building something, and the tangible piece of that was this program that was running. And less than 2 years after I left that job, everything was completely removed, just completely burned to the ground. And for a good year after that, and this is 3 years out from even being employed there, I felt depressed about it. That was my Mona Lisa, my painting, my guitar, my fill in the blank that I created, and someone went and destroyed it. And for me, it was like they were destroying my value, destroying something I had created. And it was really difficult for me to overcome that. And as I think we started to transition into building 33 Sticks, that was still top of mind to me that this is going to be really hard because we're going to go into these companies, we're going to really transform the way that they work, and it very easily can be, they hire someone new and it's like, yeah, we're going to just rip this all out, and there goes our sense of value. And so because of that, I think that is a big motivator for us to focus on people first. And while we're passionate about creating tangible results from a you know implementation or analysis or transforming the way the company does business perspective, we know that is inherently very fragile. And so what I've tied kind of my satisfaction and self-worth to is less of the, well, what did we create from an analytics perspective, and more what did we enable, or how did we change people's lives that we work with? Did they get promoted? Did they get a raise? I think of Todd at the monitor all the time. Did we help inspire and enable them to do something like move their family to Hawaii for a year to work remotely, fully immersed in that environment? Those are things that can't be taken away. And so from a output perspective of what are we creating, yeah, I mean, I think there's very diminishing returns on the work that we're doing from a longevity standpoint, but the people that we're impacting, that that can't be taken away. And so for me, that's where a lot of my motivation and energy comes from a creation standpoint, is like, are we helping these people achieve something on a personal level? That to me is very fulfilling. So I guess kind of those are the top two tiers, and again, those are not really tangible things. But from there, we've talked about, obviously, the basics we're assuming are covered, right? So we have healthcare, we have some sort of retirement plan. We're kind of assuming those things are covered as part of basic compensation. And then you start to get into more of the tangible things, and this is the conversation that we were having this morning on Twitter. um, these things aren't necessarily expensive, but I think they have an incredible return on investment. And this is investing in your employees' environment. So whether you're allowing them to choose hardware that works for them, whether you give them a budget and they can buy a desk that feels good, or a chair that supports their needs, or just niceties around the office. Again, like, these are pennies on the dollar compared to what it costs to hire and keep a person employed. But the return on having an environment that your employees feel good going to work in every day is priceless in my mind.
Yeah. What are some of the things that stood out in responses you got to that?
So, I was expecting to hear, yeah, we cover, the basics, a laptop, a computer. One of the things that surprised me a little bit was the openness to choice in the hardware was a bit of a surprise to me, because when we've hired employees, and our most recent employee was no different. We said, what do you want? He's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, do you want a PC or you Mac? Do you want a laptop or a desktop? He's like, I don't understand. I'm like, well, we want you to pick what is going to feel good for you. It's like, I've never had an employer say that to me. They always said, well, this is our standard. Here's what you get. You get what you get. And so to hear that there are other employers out there saying, hey, no, like, we want you to choose what works for you, was really great to hear. I'm going to actually pull up my feed and kind of go through some of the things that we were hearing. So, lots of employers are either giving funds directly for needs, not necessarily needs, but things that they would be paying for anyway, like internet access, cell phones. So that wasn't too much of a shock. But then others saying, not only that, but we kind of have just a monthly stipend. So whether we want to, buy something for the office, to, anything really. It's like, I want plants in my office. It's gonna make me feel good. Or, maybe I use those funds and I buy, snacks or whatever. Or maybe I use those funds and I buy a subscription to a streaming service or a gym membership. And so again, I think that autonomy is great, right? It's one thing to say, here's like $50 and you have to spend it on X. I think it's another thing to say, here's $50, spend it on what's going to make your day more enjoyable. That goes to further expound on the value of that freedom and autonomy piece. And it's so incredibly valuable for employees to feel like they have um, those options. Scrolling through the feed here, there was a couple others that stood out. Companies, especially for developers, offering multiple large monitors, I think is a huge thing to do. And again, these are things that they'd be doing anyway in office, but that doesn't mean that it's a natural for them to do it for the home office setup. Yeah, lots of mentions of stipends to basically spend in certain areas to make life better. Um, Lots of mentions of docking stations. I tried to use a docking station once. I didn't like it for some reason. So yeah, I mean, I think really you can prescribe lots of things, but giving, again, following that autonomy path of giving your team some funds that they can use and say, hey, we trust you to buy things that are going to make your job better, more efficient, happier in the work, in when you're doing the work, I think is awesome to hear. um One thing that I did want to call out and is of concern to me is, um, are companies not doing this because they're not sure what the next step is? And by that I mean, we
Yeah, I'm
saw
curious what you mean by that.
so we saw this at the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw this with lots of our clients where they were sitting at a kitchen table or a little card table in the corner, in a room that was not really meant for work, or an environment that seemed very, very temporary. And I would ask the questions out of curiosity, like, what are you thinking long term? And they're like, well, my employer says, we're going to be back in the office in a couple weeks, and this was the very start of the pandemic. It's like, we don't need to really even think about home office, but this is just really temporary. It's like a couple weeks, we'll be back in the office. And so, you know, to be fair, like, no one had an idea of how long this would stretch out, and how it would change things. But again, it was kind of that it's going to go back to the way things are. So it's not really worth investing or even thinking about how to make sure that they have a good setup. Fast forward 2 years later, they're still at the kitchen table working. And I'm saying, okay, it's been 2 years. What are you thinking about long-term plans so you have a more proper work setup at home? And the feedback is, well, now we're on the tail end of the pandemic. And so we're going to be back in the office soon. So everything's going to be back to normal. So it doesn't make sense now to like invest in a home office setup or how to do it properly, because we're just going to be back in the office. So that's my biggest concern, is that, yeah, we're hearing lots of really great things from people where their employers are doing it right. But I'm guessing that we're not hearing from the larger population of people whose employers are taking that approach of, well, everything's going to be back to the way it was soon, so it doesn't even make sense for us to get them off the kitchen table. And that's concerning, because regardless of pandemic, regardless of anything else, we're not going back to the way it was before. That
Mhm.
ship has sailed. um so they need to start thinking about it.
Yeah, and like I I mean, for me, and we've beaten this to death. I don't see people going back into the office full time in many cases.
Yeah.
There are going to be legit needs to go to an office. We've talked about how we foresee the office changing, becoming more of that maker space. But I think for many employees, they're going to need that at home setup.
Hmm.
Um, I haven't seen anything recently, but now that I said it, I probably will. I know about 2 months ago, I had seen something that Apple, a company the size of Apple, was
Hmm.
having trouble getting employees to come back.
Hmm.
It was this goes back before the pandemic. They spent a ton of money on that new Apple campus, like the spaceship
Yeah,
styled
yeah, yeah.
circular building. And then 2020 hit, and at this point, people are like, "No, we don't want to go back." As nice as that building is we don't want to go back. There are a lot of people that just flat out moved away,
Yeah.
for one, but then others, for whatever reason, whether they just don't want to go back into a home office, they've embraced the remote work life. If they're having trouble getting back, and again, I haven't seen anything recently, and I know the minute I say this, something's going to pop up on one of my news feeds about the status of it, but I know they were having trouble getting people back.
It's not a surprise. And there's another company that I was reading about just yesterday. I can't remember the name of the company, but a well-known name brand company that sent out a directive that all employees are now recalled back to the home office, and we're going back to the office full time. And it was less than 48 hours. A group of, geez, maybe it was Apple. I don't know. I'm gonna have to go back and pull up the news article. A group of employees put together an internal communication to executive leadership that basically said no. deal with it. And if you're going to
Mhm.
force this, we're not going to be here. And it caused them to roll back that staunch policy and say, okay, we're still evaluating what our setup is going to be. So employees have some power right now.
Mhm.
And it's not to say they should abuse that power because their employers abused it for so many decades prior, but they need to use that power to voice um, their opinion that having more autonomy and a better work-life balance is no longer something that is a perk. It's got to be something that's part of every job. And if it's not, we're not going to deal with it. Um, and so if you're an employer, if you're in management, it really behooves you to really start thinking about this. And I think the biggest mistakes that are going to happen are employers will say, "Fine, we'll allow for more." Distributed workforce, but they're going to take the office model and try to overlay it and smash it into a remote setting, which is going to backfire spectacularly. Or worse, they're not even going to put any thought into it and just say, okay, employees, you go figure it out. Because this is hard, especially for big companies. This is hard to think through. Like, how do we compensate? What do we provide them? What structure do they need? What support do they need to figure out how to frame their day? How do we make sure they're connected with their colleagues? There's so many decisions and things that need to be made that I think, unfortunately, a lot of companies simply aren't going to do it and just hope it happens organically. And for a select few, it will because they have really amazing cultures, but for most, it won't. And I think that they're really going to suffer because of it. And employees are, again, putting this high up on their list of wants and needs, right below compensation, that if you're not offering it and you're not proactively thinking about how to build this as a healthy part of your culture, you will absolutely, if you haven't already, lose your best employees. And you will have an incredibly difficult job, not only finding great employees, finding any employees. If you don't offer it, it's going to be hard to hire. And,
Well,
and we're seeing this in some of these bigger companies that have had job openings for like 18 months with really good pay. And they're like, no one's interested. I'm like, well, yeah, we have a shitty culture. Like, then people have options and they're going to get more freedom and autonomy. It's not a surprise to me you're not able to hire.
what about those companies that it's leaked out that as the employee base has become more distributed, that they're adjusting salaries based on cost of living of location? So it's, "Oh, you used to work in our New York office, and now you've moved to, you know, um, North Carolina, South Carolina. Cost of living is dramatically different, so we're gonna adjust your salary down." You hear about that every now and then.
Oh yeah, and it's I mean, and this was happening long before and I'll come back to this just as a something that really grinds my gears. But this was happening before this whole kind of migration with the pandemic. Is this debate around what sets salary? Is it geography? Is geography the overwhelming factor in your salary? And when you break geography apart from the job, now what? And and if you're going to allow fluidity, then what? So if it is still geography, well, how often are you adjusting that? What if you have a nomad and 1 month they're in LA and another month they're in Singapore? Like, how are you going to handle that? It's incredibly complex. And so the easy answer is you don't. You pay versus for the value that they're creating. But I remember at a previous employer, we had that exact scenario. We hired a guy based in Manhattan who was obviously super expensive because Manhattan, super expensive to live there, super expensive to employ someone there. So we hired him and we paid him Manhattan wages. Within 6 weeks, he relocated to rural Florida somewhere, like dirt cheap cost of living. And the executives of the company were mad, mad, mad. And I remember we had a meeting about it. Said, well, we got to bust his salary down. Like, we got to reset it to like rural Florida salaries. I'm like, we can't do that. Like, how do you think that's going to make him feel that we're like, oh, nope, you're not worth as much as we thought you were worth? Um, so it's a very dangerous and slippery slope. And we've kind of, well, obviously from day one being a fully distributed company, that was never something that we took into consideration to pay for Geo. We from the very beginning said, okay, what value is this employee going to generate for us? and what is then the appropriate compensation for an exchange of that value that should be fair to both sides, and we don't care where they live. It was very easy for us to solve that. But again, it's easy to do that from day one. It's a lot harder to do it when you have established norms and culture. But I will tell you, if you're thinking about adjusting your employees' salaries, say, hey, yeah, we're going to allow you to work anywhere. But as part of that, and you know how they're going to roll this out, they're going to send out some lame copy and paste email from someone in HR that says, hey, just an FYI, we're doing salary adjustments and reviews based on where you've migrated to over the last 2 years. So expect to hear from your boss, on that adjustment. And then you get the emails like, oh, we see Jim moved to like upstate New York. So we're going to have to adjust his salary down. There's going to be a lot of upset employees that are going to be leaving companies when that happens, because it is just a kick in the gut for that to happen to someone.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not surprised whenever I hear it. Like, and we're talking about, let's call it what it is, the large faceless corporations,
Mm-hmm.
where you're a line on a spreadsheet, you're a resource, you're not a person,
Yeah.
and it's managing to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, and they have this, I think one of the things that is in there, one of the things that is going to be their biggest struggle is they have this, I don't know if superiority complex is the right word, but they feel like they're in the driver's seat for any negotiation. It's like these people are just resources. It doesn't matter if Jim leaves, there's always going to be another Jim. And I think that that is faulty reasoning. Um, Are we all replaceable? Sure. I mean, there's always someone that can step in and do our job. But if as a company, as a brand, if it starts to be well known that our culture is like that, that we don't value people, that we see you as replaceable and we're going to treat you like that,
The next gym is not coming along.
Jim is not coming along, because Jim has options more than ever now. Because it's not just his local city or state or within a 100-mile radius that he can be employed. He can be employed literally anywhere in the world. And so that next gym isn't coming along because he's got options and he knows how you've treated previous employees. So good luck hiring. It's going to be a difficult, difficult path for you once that gets out, and it will get out. It absolutely will catch up at some point.
So, I mean, this has been really, really good. So I want to start wrapping up, and we've hit on multiple things. And really, I don't have many questions because we kind of hit on what we want to talk about.
Yeah.
Like, again, kind of to recap, like what we've heard from previous generations when it comes to employment benefits, it's always been medical, retirement, those kinds of components. And I mean, at this point, like I would even say it's almost granted at this
Yeah.
point. Like you got to take those things for granted. It's what other things should you think of
That's right.
and not get blinded, salary wise, but then also we've been thinking in terms a lot so far of the employee. So I do kind of want to kind of think of another way. Employer.
Yeah.
Um, what are benefits that every employer should think about? Like, I really do think, like, thinking back to what we've talked about so far, it's really come from the context of the employee, the autonomy over your day, the equipment that you need. Especially many people are remote these days. You have all of the equipment, hardware, software that you need at home. Um, as an employer, are there certain benefits that should jump out to say, yes, we should absolutely offer this or consider it or think about it?
So I think there are two, and I'm not necessarily going to jump into specifics, but just kind of talk high level. And those are things that enable you to have a better connection with your team. Absolutely should be thought about, and that could be anything from getting people together to travel budgets to being creative on how teams can kind of play together in a virtual world. And then two is probably more important, any kind of benefits that provide a sense of autonomy for your employees to create better work-life balance. So if that's niceties around things like, again, whether that's gym memberships or food plans or fill in the blank, there's an endless array of possibilities to what can fit in that budget, or in that bucket. But anything that employers can offer that will help their employees find better work-life balance, especially if you're thinking long term. I mean, we're talking pennies on the dollar, and the returns are so huge that it's too difficult to calculate. And again, um, as more and more employers start to recognize that fact, they're going to start offering them, and it's not going to be a shock. When I put something out and say, "Hey, we do X, Y, and Z," and people are like, "What the hell? That's the most amazing thing ever!" It's going to get to a point where it's like, "Well, yeah, lots of companies are doing that." And if you're not, then again, your ability to attract not only great employees, just employees in general, is going to be so incredibly difficult. So as we're moving more to an asynchronous way of working, more fluidity in where and how and what people do, giving people some ability to connect with the rest of their team, and giving people tools and abilities to better structure their work-life balance, it will become an absolute must as a perk, as a benefit that employers offer.
There's a couple things I want to say, and I'm trying to think of what I want to say first. Um, because it feels like, some of the things that you were describing there, it's almost like I've worked for one employer where there was an on-site gym,
Hmm.
and like that kind of became the norm, in the early to mid 2000s.
Yeah.
Like, some kind of like when there was a large enough campus, some kind of on-site fitness facility. And like that almost became the norm, and people started asking, well, what do you have
Do you have a
on site?
gym? Do you have a
You
cafeteria?
have a
Do you have
daycare
a
center.
right? And here's the problem, and those things are awesome, but here's the problem that I have with it, especially in a distributed workforce, is just because it works for Jim doesn't mean it works for Jason. And so I love that we're breaking apart this concept of, well, on our campus we have this and this. And like, that's great for employees where those things matter, but those things don't matter to all your employees. So we can now break that apart, and instead of prescribing a one size fits all solution to work life balance or things that are meaningful to employees, we should embrace the fuzziness of it and create frameworks in which Jim can work with his boss to define what works best for Jim, and Jason can work with his boss to define what works best for Jason. Because I think that's one of the big things that we're realizing with office work, is that people that are huge proponents of the office and of the campus are huge proponents of it because it worked for them, and they think, well,
Ooh,
because
that's
it
a good
worked for
point.
me, it worked for everybody. But that simply isn't true. So I think being open and being empathetic that people have different work experiences, and that we should be flexible to help support the work experience that is best for them, is really the right approach to take.
Yeah. And if you covered some of this earlier, what would be your advice to employers that, thinking that this is potentially some kind of passing fad? Or better yet, another way to think about it is I could always win on salary.
So I'll address both of those quickly. So again, going back to my, well, we're going to be back in the office in 2 weeks, to well, this thing's over, so we're going to. If that continues to be your worldview, that things are going back to the way it was, you're going to lose. That's just a fact. And even if you are going back to the office full time, it's not going to be the same as it was before. There are different employees, simply are looking at how they think about work and life completely differently now. So if you're not already thinking about it, you're way behind. You have to start now, today. If you're listening to this and you haven't started thinking about it, you have to start today. Your second one was,
I could always win on salary.
I can always win on salary. Oof. If you're taking that approach, you know what that means? Unless you're one of one or two or three companies in the world, there's always going to be a company that has the ability to outbid you. So if you're winning on salary and that's all you're offering, you're on shaky ground, because someone will come along and offer someone $500 more on your team and they will take it because there's nothing else keeping them there. So once you've paid a proper salary, if that is all you're competing on, you're never going to win, because someone will always outbid you and there's nothing else holding an employee there. And I've talked with employers about this where they say, yeah, I've had employees leave and it's like for like pennies. And I'm like, that should be a telltale sign that there's nothing of meaning that's holding them there other than the salary you're paying them. And if someone's willing to pay them a few dollars more, I'm like, okay, I'll take it.
And you just said something, I don't know if you said it intentionally or not, or implied it intentionally or not. Um, Listening to what you just said, there's a second part of it. It also, it's the people that you're recruiting. If you think you could always win on salary, you're recruiting people that will always sell to the
The
highest
highest
bidder.
bidder. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a no-win situation for you go down that path. So, I mean, again, salary, it's always, I think, always going to be number one. But if you're paying a fair salary, you can't rest there, because to your point, you're going to attract people that are there for salary, and if they get a few dollars more somewhere else, they are gone. So,
Hmm.
you've got to think about those other things. And again, those other things at the top of the list aren't even tangible things. And then we can start getting into the tangible things, which are also important. But there's a lot that you need to be thinking about in order to attract and retain the best. Well, I'm going to stop saying that. Not even the best, just talent.
Mhm.
It's you're going to have to be stupid flies back from last year. Yeah. So that's my thought.
Nice, nice. Well, I mean, this has been another good conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
I like
I
this
think it's
topic.
something relevant right now on, from a couple different perspectives. Those people that are pushing their employers to remain remote, those that are kind of in a state of limbo, but those that may now, be companies either trying to recruit them or they're out looking. Things to consider, and like I kind of started off with, is things that you should think about and not get blinded just by
Yeah.
the salary.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, and I know we're wrapping up here, but from an employee standpoint, I know how seductive it is to get wrapped up in the salary, but I've seen it happen way too many times where someone leaves for the salary and the honeymoon period is less than 2 weeks and they're like, what the hell did I do? So there's so much more to life. And that isn't to say you shouldn't be driven to maximize what you can earn, but if that is what you're chasing, you're never going to have enough, and ultimately you're never going to feel satisfied. So be careful for chasing that as your goal.
So true, so true. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up there, and because I think that's a great way to wrap it up. And we'll catch everybody later.
See you.
See ya.